My name is Cahal McLaughlin. I am 73 years of age next Tuesday, and my current residence is a little village called Kearney, County Down, Northern Ireland. And my place of birth is a town called Portlanone, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. It was a small village, and we had a big family. We came from Catholic background. This kind of difference between Catholic and Protestant wasn't really anything I was aware of as a child, particularly, apart from we went to different schools. And my father was a shopkeeper, but being a small shopkeeper, he suffered when the chain stores came into town and underpriced him, basically. So he moved to Belfast and took up a job as a barman, and a year later we joined him. So at the age of 10, I moved from the little village to the city of Belfast. And that was quite an interesting move for a 10-year-old, because it was like moving away from when everyone knew everything you did in a little town to the anonymity that came with the city. It was wonderful. Living in the city of Belfast was in the 60s. Again, you were aware of these differences. I lived in Duncairn Gardens, and you were aware that the school you went to was a Catholic school and there was a Protestant school nearby, but none of it particularly had a big impact until, and it's coming up tomorrow, the 12th of July is an annual celebration of something that happened in 1690 when King Billy defeated the forces of King James. And this is celebrated by the Unionist population every year. When I was in a village in Portlanone, this was something where there was bands, there was music, there was ice cream, there was candy floss. When I moved to Belfast in the 60s, this was even before the conflict started, I noticed a slight tension. I remember hearing the band and running out to the front of the house on the street to see the band passing by. But the atmosphere was tense. It wasn't as celebratory, as warm, as open. And I think it's because Duncairn Gardens, as it turned out, was a kind of a borderline Catholic Protestant area. So I began to notice difference. And then when I went to secondary school, things were you were starting to hear things in the news. So let's say 67, 68, the start of protest marches, you would see it on the news. I was 15, 16 years of age, and you started to be aware of it. And then I remember being at school. Some of our school friends came from an area in North Belfast neighbourhood called Ardoyne. And one of the things the civil rights movement kind of escalated to such an extent that the state, instead of negotiating and compromising, made the huge mistake, and even some unionist politicians have said that since, came down very heavy. A lot of violence was used against civil rights protesters, and it was like a powder keg, and things just blew up. And because the state itself, let's say I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but the island was divided in 1921, 22, and the north was preserved in this very artificial border that guaranteed a unionist majority. And it had a record of discrimination against Catholics, who were a third of the population at that point, in employment, in housing, and even in voting, right up until 1969-70. If you were a Protestant and you owned property, you had 2 votes. Not just one, you had 2 votes, one based on property and one based on your house. Unemployment rates amongst Catholics were very high. Working class unionists, Protestants, tended to get the jobs. So that discrimination was structural. And so what happened was that when this kind of civil rights against that, trying to get equality, inspired by the United States civil rights movement in part, And then the reaction was very violent from the state. People were beaten off the streets. And that triggered an historical pattern in Ireland of military resistance, very quick shift to military resistance. I know in the United States there was a certain shift towards the Black Power movement, some of which, was armed. That was quite limited in some ways compared to here. There was an historical pattern. It shifted to military opposition really quickly, and the resurrection of the Irish Republican Army came onto the streets to defend communities. And when I was at school at the age of about 17, 18, Belfast, I was living in a middle class area, but Ardoyne was a working class area in the north of Belfast, and it was mixed with Catholics and Protestants. The conflict quickly created a separation of populations. It was the largest movement of a civil population in Europe since the Second World War. Of course, it's been all overtaken by Bosnia, Herzegovina and places like that. But in 69, 70, 71, that movement of population where people feared living in the same community and left or were forced out. What happened in Ardoyne was that the Protestants moved out but burned all their houses. And I remember the school, I don't know who initiated it. It wasn't the teachers, it was the students. We organised collections to fund, because a lot of the burning had displaced Catholic homes as well. And also at the weekend, we volunteered and went up as teenagers to kind of shovel out all the burned debris so that the houses could be rebuilt. So in a sense, my political awareness was there's discrimination here, there's opposition to it by the civil rights movement, and then the state itself is coming down very, very violently. And so that kind of opened up a lot of questions in my head about the legitimacy of government. When I went to university from school at the local Queen's University, the student movement had been, I went in about 71, 71, yeah. When the earlier 71, 72, the earlier student movement in 68 had been very prominent in the civil rights movement. It had quietened a little bit because of repression, but it had got a legacy. There were still meetings, and I remember attending meetings. And we held one of those symbolic 24-hour hunger strikes to protest against the state's violence. So I was looking around for ideas, organisations, who to join, who to support. And there were a couple of groups around People's Democracy, and there was a Marxist group as well at the time. I can't remember what it was called, but I was kind of searching around for where to spend my time and what ideas, how to kind of refine my ideas, not just about critique, but also how do you replace it. I fairly quickly, due to more personal and political reasons, I dropped out of the university. I think it was a bit of both, but it was mostly personal. It just wasn't doing for me what I'd hoped. I'd hoped it would open up lots of avenues and possibilities and discussions, but it was the university system here remains to this day to some extent. The vast majority of students are local. They don't come from all over. They're very local, and so you tend to get a replication of past pupils associations, etc. And I wanted something different, so I decided to apply for and got accepted to a college in Leeds, in Yorkshire, in England. And I was still looking when I went there. I was still looking for something, because political activity was kind of not only happening in Ireland, but also in England. There was a lot of political activity around industrial disputes. And the other thing that I noticed in England was this kind of resurgence of what we now call intersectionality. So you weren't just looking at civil rights or national questions, or there were libertarian groups or socialist groups or feminist groups or gay groups. And that kind of opened up a lot of thinking in my head. And I met someone called Tony Kearney, who's passed away. And Tony was an anarchist, and we just got. It was one of those personal relationships where you bonded immediately, and so I got to read a lot of his books. And Vernon Richards' book on the Spanish Civil War completely changed my outlook, completely changed it. And I became involved in the local anarchist scene in Leeds. I think it was the balancing of freedom and equality, and of course justice as well. But freedom and equality, it made philosophical sense to me that you can't have one without the other. And when I read about and had been reading about the Russian Revolution, the idea of the kind of the movement. I think the slogan was "all power to the Soviets," and the Soviets made perfect sense. It was neighborhoods, it was industry taking over and running their own space. All power to the Soviets then became all power to the party, and then all power to the party became all power to the leader. And that just, to me, I understood that trajectory. And so while I was interested in Marx and had read Marx, looking for ideas, I realized that there was a weakness in this. And what the Spanish Revolution did, and anarcho-syndicalism did for me, was say that it is possible to maintain all power to the Soviets. You don't need a party. In fact, the danger of having a party is that it believes that it will take power and then it will waste away. And of course, never known anyone who will take power and willingly hand it over again. So the question was to decentralize and manage power so that it didn't go into the hands of a very small group, but was circulated through accountability, etc., etc. So that core idea was really, really important for me. And I think it also, it again, I mentioned the word intersectionality, sectionality, which we never mentioned at the time, but it could apply to almost any scenario. And it meant that class was core because as an anarcho-syndicalist, but it didn't dominate or prevent discussion, debate, and taking positions on sexuality, on the environment, on community work, on different areas. And that's what I really liked as well. Some of the Marxist ideas or ideologies, and continue to do this, submerge a lot of those other concepts, ideas, and existences under class. Whereas for me, class links them all, absolutely, but doesn't submerge them. So that was really important for me at that time. And so I got involved in different things. There was, I think it was 1974 was a national coal miner strike in England. And I remember we were, out on the streets supporting it locally in the city, getting on buses, going to group meetings and whatnot. And also it was a period when the Tory government was starting to cut back a lot of public services. And Margaret Thatcher at that point had removed free milk from school children. And I remember being on a bus with lots of other people going to London for a big national demonstration against this new reactionary policy. I think what continues is that authoritarianism that we have currently at the moment, a government. I think what's happening in Gaza, Palestine, is really, really kind of interesting because it's a continuation of something that has had very, very little interruption since 1948. The Europeans, Germany in particular, but the Holocaust, the genocide that had been committed, instead of paying atonement for that, instead of kind of engaging and taking responsibility for that, the problem was exported. And it was a colonial export on creation of a state at the expense of another people. And that kind of mirrored our own history, in a sense, in Ireland, that we had been colonised and a part of the north had been kind of taken over and populate it deliberately, and then a state create it to preserve it. So we could see parallels with that. But one of the things for me is that everyone, not everyone, the media like to say what started in October 7. Well, of course, anyone who knows the history knows that it started way before that. So I think colonialism continues. That is the most extreme form of political state colonialism. But the other forms of colonialism are economic, political, media, and they continue. The division between the North and the South is as severe now as it was during the periods of empire. Genocide is not committed to the same scale and the same number of countries as before, but colonialism will tolerate genocide if it serves its interest. So I think what continues is the domination of the colonial powers. They may not have the territory anymore that Germany and Britain and France had in the past, but they have the influence, they have the power, they have the connections, and they have the extraction and the exploitation over those countries. So I think colonialism continues. I managed 4.5 years in Leeds. I dropped out again of college. It's ironic I'm a professor at a university now, because my early days was I didn't want anything to do with these places. And I tried out different things in Leeds. I worked on the buses, public transport, different things. And then I felt the power, the kind of pull to come home again. I'd been involved in some political actions in Leeds. 2 anarchists, Mary and Noel Murray, had been sentenced to death and were going to be hanged. And we had protests outside the Irish institutions in Leeds. And so when I had the pull to come back home again, I immediately got involved in that campaign. And through that, I met an anarchist in Belfast, Ronnie Graham, and Dave Heineman. And we started to get involved in different issues, and we decided we needed a presence, a physical presence. And so we set up a community bookshop, Just Books, set up in the late 70s. And we made a number of decisions about it. It would be collective, it would be in the centre of town, and it would be where it would be in either the Protestant or the Catholic. I'm using these terms shorthand. You could say nationalist or unionist or Republican or loyalist. But we choose a spot that was in the centre of town where the 2 main roads coming in, one unionist, one nationalist, met in the city centre. So we deliberately didn't want to be seen as Republican. I mean, there's lots of politics around, being anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. We would be identified as Republican, but we weren't. And the bookshop ran, and fairly soon after we set up the bookshop as a community bookshop, selling all sorts of things you couldn't get in Belfast. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the Belfast City Hall put up a window celebrating gay campaigns in Belfast. And there's a little kind of section of it. It's a mosaic, really. And it says Just Books on it. And the designer, creator was asked, why did he put Just Books in it? And he said it was the only place you could buy gay news during the conflict. So we sold stuff that was environmental, that was feminist, that was gay, as well as loads of community stuff. And very shortly, we set up the Belfast Anarchist Collective. And there was an overlap in membership, very close. Most people who were in the anarchist group were in Just Books. Most people just running Just Books were also in the anarchist collective. And the anarchist collective got involved in local campaigns. And at that time, that would have been the kind of late 70s, early 80s. And what was happening was the prison protest was escalating. There were strip searches in the women's prison, and there was a no wash protest and hunger strike beginning in the men's prison and also in the women's prison. And we became involved in that. But we did other things as well. There was an attempt to build a nuclear power station at Carnsore Point in County Wexford in the south. And we joined the opposition to that. There was an occupation every year of this site to stop them building, excuse me. And then there was an attempt to start uranium mining in Donegal. And, some of our members went up there as well to protest and stop. And both of those were successful, neither proceeded. So we're involved in different sorts of projects, community, national, environmental, feminist, etc. So we were active, and we produced a little paper once every couple of months called Out of Control. And that lasted for 3 or 4 years. In fact, there's a website called Just Books, and it has a kind of an archive of all the publications. And then it stopped for a period and it restarted under a different name, which was the Irish name Unreal, meaning anarchy. So that ran again for a number of years. So we had the bookshop downstairs. There was a cafe above it, where we were a very small cafe where we ran events, public meetings, discussions, things like that. And then there was a print shop on top run by David Marilyn. And they were the local community printers, but they did a lot of our stuff. So we published. We did postcards, we did posters. And some of the posters were kind of dark, humorous, satirical, political posters that we would kind of, in the evening, go and stick up around town. And then we also had something called the A Centre later on, which was during the conflict, Belfast city centre often was quiet at night. There was very few common places that people could go to. People retreated to their communities. But the punk movement was having a real problem getting venues in the city centre. And there was a gay club that ran in the evenings, and they leased to us daytime events. So on a Saturday afternoon, we had punk events, music events there. And some big names came over from England. Poison Girls, Crass came over and played for us. So the anarchist group ran, for quite a number of years, right up until the late 80s. Yeah. It's about sharing, co-owning, co-authoring. Yes, co-owning and co-authoring, I think, is probably really important. There is, of course, the immediate practical needs of what you're doing, and then there is the vision, as it were. And the vision is obviously very complex because of scale, because of the international scale, because of the national scale, because of the development of digital technology. So planning out how one manages that is certainly, real challenging, real difficulty, but I think can be done. And a really good way to start is to practice it in everyday life. And so I'm not a reform versus revolution person. I'm a kind of everyday activity and the future go hand in hand. They relate to each other. What you're doing today, in a sense, is a foreshadowing of what is going to happen in the future. And so in the practices, because I moved into filmmaking after the bookshop, we formed a cooperative video group community, and then we ended up making lots of work for broadcast. And then I moved to England, to London, where I spent 16 years working as an independent freelancer. And then I took a degree, became an academic. And being an academic, I discovered that I became an academic because I wanted to take time, because I had children, and being a freelance filmmaker, you have no time. It's unpredictable. It's a crazy kind of system. It's fine for single people, but once you have children, it's crazy. So I thought I would teach and then go back to filmmaking, but I found that in teaching, I could actually practice by making films using co-authorship, sharing. So it's a roundabout way of saying that in all my practice, when I work with people in Haiti and Brazil and South Africa and Peru, wherever else I work, all the work that I do with those people is sharing. And they co-own their contribution to that. And they can withdraw, and some people do withdraw the material, but they co-own the material, and that's so absolutely important. It's not just an ethical question. For me, it's a fundamental anarchist principle that anyone who produces work the product of that work is co-owned by them, should never be taken away and sold, used without their permission, without negotiation and their permission. So for me, the anarchist principle is primarily in my practice every day, but I've never given up on the idea of it becoming more than local community. We live in very, very difficult times, and I think the vision is cloudy at the minute about that possibility, but I believe it is as possible today. And the Spanish Civil War is still an inspiration for me, because it wasn't just about the trade unions, it was also about the Ateneos, it was the way everyone organised. And it didn't collapse internally, it didn't collapse through its own failures. It collapsed because of external violence, military strength, military superiority. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that my view is it's the everydayness. In some ways, it's almost what you do is as important as what you say. So yeah, I could call myself an anarchist, but it doesn't mean anything unless I'm practicing it. For me, it is. I see it in places where people don't call themselves anarchists, or the projects aren't called anarchists. I see it when people collaborate, when they cooperate, when they organise a campaign, when they share responsibility. So that's what keeps me hopeful, is that everydayness, because I think we are living through a period where it's becoming much, much more challenging, much more difficult to imagine the overthrow of capitalism. But I'm not fatalistic about it. I believe it is possible, possibly, certainly almost not in my lifetime. But I believe that I'm not a pessimist to think that capitalism and the state will in perpetuity dominate our lives. I can see examples, everyday examples, where people successfully organise in their communities in a way that I would call libertarian socialist or anarchist, even though they wouldn't call it. So for me, the everydayness is absolutely critical, probably because of the dark clouds of capitalism and authoritarianism that hang over us. That ability to be able to kind of survive that, because that can be very anger producing, very depressing, very make you very pessimistic. But I think the light that occurs when people collaborate, when people work together, when people celebrate their own and each other's culture and work on output is what keeps me going. I suppose one of the examples, and I've never called it anarchist, and maybe some of the participants would kind of pull out if they thought they were taking part in an anarchist project, but the Prison's Memory Archive was something after the conflict was over, after the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, there has been no equivalent to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The state itself is so implicated in a lot of the violence that it will certainly not initiate this. And I can't see any of the paramilitary groups ever initiating anything. So there is talk constantly about some form of official legacy body to help deal with whether it's judicial, storytelling, truth recovery, constantly talking, constantly. Nothing has come out, and that's decades ago. A number of community groups, bottom-up groups, have come up with their own little storytelling projects. Some are based in a community, a constituency. Some are to do with a constituency, say, of occupation, nurses, police officers, or whatever. The prisons here were hugely symbolic during the conflict, and the prisons were closed when the conflict was over because the prisoners were released on license. And after many, many years of persuasion, negotiations rather, we were allowed to go into the prison and film people return. And we came up with 3 protocols, and this to me is kind of almost anarchist principles. One is co-authorship. that if you come and tell your story, you co-own that story, always. To, in a sense, following on from that is called life storytelling. So instead of me being a journalist, and I've worked in television, instead of me being a journalist asking you questions to get the answer I want, you decide the agenda. You decide what you want to talk about, and more importantly, or as importantly, what you don't want to talk about. And the third protocol was inclusivity. So it wasn't just privileging one over another. And politically, I could be persuaded to talk about the sides and where I would take sides. But in terms of an archive, in terms of storytelling, it had to be an equal access. And we ended up recording in the men's prison and the women's prison, 160 people, 300 hours of material. And they range from prison officers to prisoners to teachers to chaplains to medical staff to visitors, relatives. And we continue, that now sits in the public record office, those 300 hours of audiovisual. People would walk and talk. They would come into a cell, they would go into a hospital wing, they would go out into the yard, and it would trigger their memory and they would tell us their story. So we have this wonderful, wonderful archive. And so for me, in a sense, it's combined my upbringing, living through a conflict period, trying to find a way to make sense of it, and my kind of creative ability when I became a filmmaker to then apply that methodology to the history of this place and make a contribution. So for me, that is at its core an anarchist project. And I know that if some prison officers hear me say that, they'll say, "What? Take me out of that." But I'm hoping they will appreciate and understand my definition of anarchism doesn't necessarily counter the principles of co-ownership. Really importantly is particularly in filmmaking, but no, in just books and Unreal, all of these projects I've talked about were collaborations. I think I've only mentioned a couple of people's names. There are so many people I've worked with who have inspired me. And I think anyone going through a journey of life, whether it's, about anarchism or about any other area, you're always collaborating with other people. And most recently, it's been Siobhan. We've worked participatory practices with rural communities in Brazil, with hip-hop people, with people living in favelas facing state violence. And we've always applied participatory practice, co-ownership practice. So all of the successes that I've managed to kind of be lucky to be part of is because of all the other people who I've had the fortune to work with.